Thanks everyone for joining us at the Project Censored Radio Show on Pacifica Radio. I am your co-host Eleanor Goldfield along with Mickey Huff. And we're very glad right now to welcome to the program Sarah Lazare, who's the editor for Workday Magazine and a contributing editor for In These Times. Sarah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I wanted to invite you on here to kind of shine some light on an area that never really gets any light shed on it in the corporate media. Uh, a particular point of making connections, and you've written about this, how the immigration and the raids and the oppression against migrants is a class issue, and you wrote about this in an article from October. Quote: "Unlike the immigrants now being abducted off the streets, employers rarely find themselves the target of immigration enforcement beyond fines that are already factored into their cost of doing business." End quote. So these are low wage workers, they're poor folks. And I was wondering if you could expound on that a bit and highlight the importance of this class aspect. I'm reminded of coal companies who used to go up to New York and get folks fresh off the boats and offer them a job, the American dream, bring them down to West Virginia and Kentucky, where they essentially worked as indentured servants, not paid in American money and things like that. So this is like a very American, it's a very American issue. And I was wondering if you could highlight the importance of that class aspect when we're talking about this war on migrants and refugees.
Yeah, so I live in Chicago, and since September 8th, we've seen Operation Midway Blitz, where heavily armed, usually masked federal agents have threaded through Chicago and neighboring suburbs, snatching people often from work sites or on their way to work. We've seen day laborers heavily targeted when they're standing in parking lots looking for work at places like Home Depot. We've seen street vendors. We've seen people working at flea markets. We've seen a host of workers, domestic workers, nannies, house cleaners. Um, but it's not just the moments where people are snatched and stolen from their communities. There's also an invisible form of terror, or invisible might be the wrong word. I'd say less visible form of terror, where workers have to live in fear. I have talked to workers who sometimes have to hide in their house. Here in Chicago, there's been an outpouring of resistance, people blowing whistles, sounding the alarm that ICE is nearby, often chasing them by foot, by car, or by bike. I talked to one house cleaner who told me she really appreciates the solidarity, but it's also really scary to hide in your house and to hear the whistles sounding. And when people hide, it means that they can't go to work, and it often means that they're losing income. And in some neighborhoods, a lot of people have lost income all at the same time, which has led to a certain slump in economic activity in that area, and sort of the problem of poverty and difficulty making rent or trying to figure out how you're going to eat gets compounded. There's also the issue of unscrupulous employers using the current climate to worsen their abusive practices, like wage theft. I talked to one poultry worker who told me that when fewer people show up to work because they're afraid of federal agents detaining them, it means that there's somewhat of a work speed up for her because she still has to get the work done and she doesn't get more money but has to do the work of other people. I talked to warehouse workers in a nearby suburb, I'm not going to say where, who told me that they have faced outright discrimination against immigrants from their employer, who they believe is emboldened by the current climate. So there's also that broader issue as well. And then just one more thing I want to mention is that one of the really big challenges when people get abducted on the job is that sometimes their families or loved ones don't even find out they've been abducted. So it's been a really big challenge just for local advocates to find the names of people who were abducted. And that's just really scary for folks.
Yeah, of course. And I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned because the workers that then are able or feel, I don't know if comfortable is the right word, but feel that they can go to work and then are burdened with extra work. Do you see that this kind of environment is building solidarity? Like, oh, it's so awful that my colleagues are in this position, or is it building a resentment? Like, do you see divisions being caused by this, or is it building solidarity, or perhaps a mix?
You know, it's tough because the people I speak to, I get in touch with through worker centers and through worker advocates. And I have overwhelmingly heard messages of solidarity. Reality is always more complex. You know, I think that there are two things happening at the same time. On the one hand, federal agents are targeting labor organizers and labor leaders. And on the other hand, people are being targeted for not being organized, and the vast majority of people being detained are not in unions. Um, but there are all sorts of ways people are banding together, and that's what I've been overwhelmingly focused on. You know, Chicago's a giant city, it's a really complex place. So this isn't the only story to tell, but I've been really focused on the ways that people are trying to show solidarity and support. There are a lot of ways that people are trying to do that. You know, GoFundMe's are so imperfect, but there have been so many GoFundMe's, people helping out with groceries, both paying for groceries and delivering groceries, people buying out street vendors so that instead of having to sit outside all day, vulnerable to federal agents, they can just go home and, you know, not have to worry about bringing in an income because all of their food has been bought for the day. There's one group called Cycling X Solidarity that just is a group of people who ride bicycles from one street vendor to another and sort of do mass buyouts. Um, there's also been efforts to protect school children and parents during school pickup and drop off and throughout the day, being organized by a combination of parent groups, and members of Chicago Teachers Union, the big teachers union in Chicago, and even sometimes with the help of principals, you know, depending, it varies widely according to schools. So that's also been really incredible. Um, you know, there's always more that could be done. And, you know, I'm not saying it's perfect, but there has been a really tremendous outpouring.
Well, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about the tactic aspect because this is something that props up regardless of issue, whether it be, you know, like ecocide or genocide, certainly. But the pitfalls of the law. I recently spoke with an immigration lawyer who was saying that their clients don't even want to go to court because now ICE is using courthouses as basically like you know a place to pick up the next round of people for their concentration camps. So I'm curious how you see law being used or not being used because people feel that there's no point to it or people are afraid to go to court and so are pretty much primarily or even entirely focusing on tactics that employ this kind of direct action and putting bodies in between ICE and their targets.
It's tough because federal agents are blatantly violating the law. I mean, a lot of know your rights trainings focus on make sure that they have a signed judicial warrant, don't allow them entry before they've shown this to you. In reality, they've just been violating that left and right. I will say that Chicago has a robust community of movement lawyers who are very aware of the limitations of legal tactics, but nonetheless try to use them in support of movements. And these have really run the gamut. You know, there are immigration attorneys who have been working extremely hard trying to get people who are either in detention or worried about being detained, all the support that they can get. There's this crew of movement lawyers with the National Lawyers Guild who have been going to protests and demonstrations. There have been so many incidents where Chicago area community members have been terribly mistreated and violently treated by federal agents, including at the Broadview detention facility in Broadview, Illinois. And we've seen members of the NLG who, like during the course of legal observing, have themselves been injured. There have been all sorts of attempts to push back and fight back. Right now, the Trump administration is blocking a judicial order to release hundreds of people currently detained at the Broadview Detention Center. So it's a really tough climate. I will say that, using movement attorneys are amazing, and that's one tool, but also just straightforward organizing has been somewhat of a deterrent. It's always hard to know exactly what impact it has. But there have been incidents where ICE agents have been chased off or deterred, or where an angry crowd even succeeded in wresting individuals out of the custody of ICE. So we've seen some successes. With something like this, it's always hard because you want to both highlight the power of organizing, but you don't want to undersell how terrible federal agents are being. With the funding increases that Trump's deportation machine has received, if it were an army, it would be the 13th largest army in the entire world. That's a huge amount of resources, and they have the ability to do what they're doing now and worse for a very long time. So I don't want to make it sound like it's as easy as, the people organize and defeat them. I think there are some real challenges, and it's really tough, from North Carolina to Minnesota right now. It's a tough time.
Yeah, absolutely. Though I was very proud of my hometown, Charlotte, stepping up in ways that people didn't expect Charlotte to, because people assume that in the South, it's a foregone conclusion. Everybody's just a right-wing nut job. But learn your Southern radical history, folks. Um, and I wanted to talk about like the kind of like how this bleeds across different issues again, because you mentioned earlier that employers are using this fear and this extreme oppression and stress to target their workers and to engage in things like wage theft. But it's also like on top of that, the job market is absolutely atrocious. Business Insider recently had a headline, though clickbaity, was uh, quite disturbing, with the announcement that you're now statistically more likely to get into Harvard than you are to land a job. And so I wanted to ask you, like, how do you see employers not just using this to engage in things like wage theft, but also then going after union organizers who might be, someone like me who has all of their paperwork or whatever, but is engaging in something in parallel to all of this the horrific deportation machine, but is also engaging in activity that the employer just doesn't really like.
Yeah, so you bring up a really good point. Things are really tough right now. It's not an easy time to get by. A lot of people, no matter how worried they are, no matter how at risk they are, they don't have the option to not go to work. So one of the things we're seeing is people going to work when they know it puts them at risk, and that's really scary. And it leads to a kind of trauma and anxiety that I think is hard for people to understand unless they've been through it. So that's one thing that I've heard over and over. Another thing is that it's very difficult to quantify right now. It's hard to know exactly how much of an uptick we're seeing in terms of abuses, in terms of employers taking advantage of the current moment to worsen the already existing hyper exploitation of undocumented people. We know that it's not just undocumented people that are targeted. Immigrants in general, or people just perceived as being immigrants, are falling under the crosshairs of the Trump administration. So that's also another factor. I will say that I know of several incidents, and that when I talk to organizers, they say things are getting worse. Everyone wants to make sure that it's clear that immigrants have always been a hyper exploited community of people, and that there are longstanding practices of using threats of calling ICE, for example, to crack down on organizing efforts or to get away with things like wage theft. But everyone I've talked to said that it's just gotten a lot worse in the Chicago area since Operation Midway Blitz began, and also since the Trump administration really came to power. I know of one incident of an anonymous individual. So this is really telling of the times. A lot of people I talk to, not only do they not want me to use their name, they don't want me to even say what state they're in, but there's one anonymous individual in an unnamed state that was a witness in a wage theft case, who was then um, uh, got targeted by immigration authorities. And the folks I talked to believe that that was the employer calling them to sort of get out of the wage theft situation. Um, yeah, and then there are these higher profile cases of labor leaders being detained. I mean, I think David Huerta, an SEIU leader out in the Los Angeles area, I mean, that was so dramatic and stunning just because he's a really known, really public figure. Um, yeah, and then, I guess the case that I mentioned earlier, the warehouse workers in the Chicago suburbs, I heard from folks that they believe anti-immigrant bias in general was used to crack down on their organizing effort. They're not members of a union, but they were doing some work trying to demand some basic improvements in terms of pay and conditions. And yeah, I don't want to say more than that, but I'll just say that the people I talked to credibly believed that the employer took advantage of anti-immigrant bias to crack down on them.
Well, and with that, I want to ask because you've written about this as well, how and you've talked about it too, how workers are stepping up to protect their colleagues and workplaces from ICE. But what specifically? Because I think there's also this lack of connection, and I want to talk about how corporate media fosters this lack of connection. But there's a lack of connection or understanding as to how unions, because I think when people hear unions, they're like, yeah, so they're there so you can have like more time off and I don't know, go to your kid's birthday party or something, and a higher wage. But like, what is the connection between unions and actually protecting undocumented or at-risk workers?
So there are two examples that immediately come to mind. One is the Chicago Teachers Union had strike action teams set up. It's a union that's known for demanding really strong contracts and going on strike. And one aspect of strike action plans is having communication structures in place. And I talked to one teacher, her name is Liz Winfield, and she told me that teachers activated those communications networks when responding to ICE crackdowns at or near schools. So that's one example where you can actually take union infrastructure and use it to mobilize quickly in response to threats. The other thing I want to highlight is there are a lot of workers' centers in the area. One of them, Latino Union of Chicago, has been doing something called Adopt a Hiring Site, where they work with volunteers in the community to just go be physically present with day laborers while they're standing outside looking for work. We have seen that at Home Depots throughout the city and suburbs, but between 12 and 15 sites currently have Adopt a Hiring Corner efforts going on, and people just literally stand outside all day, chat with the day laborers, have whistles in case of federal agents coming. It's a very friendly atmosphere. People like hand out donuts to passersby, have informational materials. And yeah, that's been a like it sounds nice and friendly, but it's also really intense. Like there have been Adopt a Hiring Corner volunteers who have been physically assaulted by federal agents as well. So it's a combination of sort of having to be really aware, but also really friendly to folks.
Yeah, I mean, I usually tell people if they ask, like, oh, isn't it really really depressing to do the work that you do? And I'm like, yeah, I see the worst of humanity, but also I see the best because I see the people on the front lines who are not only fighting the current world, but dreaming up new ones. And it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. So yeah, you literally take the good with the bad.
Yeah.
Um, so I kind of want to I want to talk a little bit more about the media aspect of it because of course at Project Censored we focus a lot on media literacy and the news that didn't make the news, and a lot of that is purposeful, this idea that like oops, I forgot to mention is absurd. And particularly with this, these are stories that are underreported on purpose, right? And I'm again going back to West Virginia because I've done a lot of work there. Folks in West Virginia are not taught about the mine wars when coal miners came together across differences of culture, of language barriers, and basically took up arms and shot at coal barons to gain some basic workers' rights. And of course, you're not going to learn that because they don't want you to know that you can just shoot at a coal baron in order to gain better workers' rights. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the purposeful, the lying through omission that happens and the work that then Workday Magazine does in order to uplift these stories, not just to ensure that these stories are being told, but so that others can see this is actually the reality on the front lines. It is not what you're going to read in the New York Times or Fox News or CNN or what have you.
I really appreciate that question. I want to start by saying that there is a robust ecosystem of really great reporters in Chicago who are doing good work. And we've seen some cross newsroom collaborations that have been really exciting. This is not an exhaustive list, but I just want to name the Invisible Institute, the Chicago Reader, Injustice Watch, Unraveled, the Cicero Independent. Um, Again, that's not exhaustive, but just to name a few. But there are a few things that I think are really, really terrible that we've seen again and again in the corporate media. The biggest one is when reporters embed with federal agents. Matthew Cunningham Cook, who's a really fantastic journalist, wrote a great piece about this in the American Prospect, but we've just seen again and again and again news crews embedding with the agents who are abducting people to cover it. And it really reminds me of that practice that was used really commonly during the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq, where reporters would embed with the US military. Anytime a law enforcement or a military entity is letting you embed with them, they have calculated that it helps their propaganda efforts to do so. And reporters just really should not do that. Whether you're a photographer, whether you're a reporter, whether you're a camera or crew, um, it's a really vile practice. Especially because the Trump administration is really trying to broadcast its cruelty and turn it into a spectacle, which makes it really tough and makes you have to be really critical when you're a journalist covering it because like the Trump the federal agents in Chicago, they did a big raid on a building in South Shore, a predominantly Black neighborhood. It was absolutely violent. They descended in helicopters. They used flashbang grenades. They took people out of their homes in the middle of the night, parents and kids, some of whom were not fully clothed. They separated Black and Latino residents. It was just a total nightmare. And they made a sizzle reel broadcasting their cruelty. So when that's what they're doing, you have to really think critically about how do we not feed into the kind of fearsome, tough image they're trying to create. There's a second thing that I want to say, which is when terrible things happen in a community, oftentimes these horror stories will elicit nationwide media interest. So you'll have like the New York Times send people in. And what I want to encourage national media outlets coming to Chicago to do is don't just stick around for the horrible thing that happened, but cover the organizing that people are doing to oppose it. And I want to go back to the South Shore building because in the aftermath of that terrible raid, the tenants of that building formed a tenants union. And earlier today, they actually had a big press conference because they're being treated terribly by the present owners of the building that are trying to push everyone out. And so for a while there, that building was in the national media spotlight because this terrible, horrific raid had happened there. And my plea is that don't just cover the bad things, stick around for the organizing because these attacks, they last a long time. It's not just a single moment in time. Communities are left reeling and trying to figure out how to move forward. And that struggle is important too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what you said highlights that aspect of the 24-hour news cycle. Like, we're just going to swoop in, extract like the extractive journalism. I hate to even call it journalism, extractive practices of just I'm going to pull a story out of someone who's in trauma mode. I'm going to get up in their face with a camera. And then I'll just leave, and I've got my byline. I got my story. I have what I need. It is and it of course builds a mistrust of media in many organizing spaces as well, understandably, because there's all these extractive and honestly very violent practices. And I mean, just wrapping up here, because you mentioned like stay for the organizing, this also highlights the aspect of solutions journalism, and that the work of a journalist, I feel, is not just to say, here's a picture of what's going on, like this is what's happening, but also how people are working to change that. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that aspect and how what the work that you do in Workday and in these times does solutions journalism and not just, hey, this is like the horror show that's happening.
At Workday Magazine, we cover the labor movement, and we define the labor movement really broadly. So it's not just formal unions, it's informal organizing networks, it's worker centers. Workers are in the informal economy, formal economy, they're unemployed. We look at how poor and working class people are impacted by policies and by employers and by landlords. And we try to highlight the aspects of the labor movement that have a lot of dynamism, that are making connections between varying forms of oppression and mistreatment, and that are really trying to fight back and win. And it's an interesting time. It's a tough time because enthusiasm for labor organizing is really high, but union density is historically low. So, figuring out what's going on with the conditions and how you can move things to a better place is a really tough question, and we're really committed to trying to figure that out. We've really been prioritizing covering how labor and workers in general have been responding to the ICE escalations, not just in Chicago, just because we see that as an attack that's an attack on working people, on the ability of people to survive, on the ability of people to organize. And so we're really interested in highlighting the ways that people are responding.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's an intersection that I don't see on corporate media, again, on purpose. People don't want to make the corporate media does not want to highlight that, hey, every worker has something to do and has something to say and has a role to play in stopping the Gestapo from kidnapping people. So thank you for the work that you do. And folks, do check out both Workday Magazine, that's workdaymagazine.org, and of course in these times as well. Sarah Lazare, thanks again for coming on the show and giving us this insight into this important work that you do.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me.